Okay, what is science? That's what we're going to get into today, and biology is a type of science, so there are some overlapping things here from your middle school days that we're going to talk about, and mainly that's going to be the scientific method. But to first of all answer our question, what is science? Science is basically an organized way of gathering and analyzing evidence about the natural world. And in biology, we study the natural world and we're constantly gathering and analyzing data so that we can discover new things or about all the different living things that are in this world. So, what is our goal? Our goal is to just provide explanations for all those things taking place in the natural world. We also want to learn and understand all the different patterns that are in the world. And you, as we go through this, you will notice lots and lots of patterns in the world of biology. And that will allow us to make predictions. So, how do we go about gathering and analyzing the data so that we can meet our goals? We use what is called the scientific method. As I said, should be a review for most of you. Coming from middle school, we've gone over it probably every year there in science. So, the first thing we do is simply ask a question. Why does this happen? Okay, how does this happen? Ask a question. Then we form a hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? We'll get that in here a little bit. Most of you would call it an educated guess. It's a little bit more than that, but we'll get to that here in a little bit. After we have our hypothesis, we're going to design an experiment and test our hypothesis. Now, as we go through here, we'll talk about a certain type of experiment that we like to use in science, called a controlled experiment, but we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Once we have collected our data, we're going to analyze it. What does it mean to analyze? We're going to make sense out of the data. And once we've made sense out of the data, we're going to draw conclusions. So, 5 easy steps to the scientific method, and we can probably apply these 5 easy steps to every problem that we face in science. So, let's talk first about the hypothesis. As we said, before we can form a hypothesis, we have to have a problem. We have to ask the question. Now, we're try to find a possible explanation. Okay, a possible explanation. As I mentioned earlier, many times people will call this an educated guess, because usually before you get your hypothesis, you do some research and find out as much as you can about the topic of your problem. Now, something that is very important in the scientific explanation or our hypothesis, it must be testable. If it's not testable, we can't find out if our explanation is correct or not. So we need a testable hypothesis. Okay. Scientists will use things called inferences or logical interpretations based on what he or she already knows. And as I said, in many cases, scientists will do some prior research before forming this hypothesis. Next, we have to see if our hypothesis is correct. We're going to do that by developing an experiment or a test. And as I mentioned, the test or experiment we like to use in science is called a controlled experiment. Now, in order to understand a controlled experiment, you first must understand that there are things called variables. Variable can be any factor that can affect the outcome of an experiment. There may be just a few variables, but in many cases there are multiple variables that can affect the outcome of an experiment. Whenever doing a controlled experiment to get the best results and results that you can use to see if your hypothesis is correct, you must only use one variable, and that is called the independent variable. The variable that you are going to test, the single variable that you will test in your experiment, is called the independent variable. Okay. There is a second variable you have to pay attention to called the dependent variable. And that is the variable that will change in response to what you're doing during the experiment. Okay. It depends on the independent variable. Now, because of that, we have to develop two groups whenever doing a controlled experiment. We have an experimental group and a control group. Very easy to identify, very easy to understand. The experimental group is given the independent variable, that is the single variable that you are testing, and the control group is not given that variable, it lacks it. So that way we can see if that single variable does have an effect on the outcome of our experiment. And we'll be practicing this with a gizmo later on. Now, whenever doing an experiment, it is very important that you make detailed records of your observations. You should be writing down everything that you observe. Now, there are two main types of data that we can be collecting or observing while we experiment: quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is the one that most of you know about. If I'm talking about quantitative data, I'm talking about something that is measurable, that can be have a number applied to it, such as 5 grams of something, or 10 yellow beads, or 20 milliliters of water. On the other hand, we have qualitative data. Okay, these are things that do not have numbers assigned to them. We could talk about the shape, the texture, the odor of something. Is it round? Is it rough? Does it smell bad? Those are qualitative properties. Okay. It is important that you are recording both of these types of data whenever you are making observations. That gets us to analyzing the data. This is where we find our patterns in nature. Okay, this requires the constructions of tables and graphs. Here's an example of a table. Okay, you can see the different colors that were used, and you can see how many of each there were. Okay, very simple data table. Okay, this would be an example of a graph. This one is particularly what is actually a column graph. Many of this would call this a bar graph, comparing different sports. Okay, you can also be making line graphs. We can be making pictograms. We could actually be making bar graphs that go from side to side. And we may be making pie graphs. So all different types of graphs and tables can be used so that we can analyze and find patterns in the nature. Now, once we have analyzed that data and we find our patterns, then we can draw a conclusion. What we're trying to do is give meaning to the patterns that we have identified. In other words, we're going to explain what the data means. Okay, very, very simple. Okay, now what we are going to do next is simply go through and do a little activity together where you're going to be thinking about and answering some questions. I will give you time, and then I will answer them with you, and we'll see how you did. Okay, so just get ready, download the paper you need, or pull up the paper you need, and let's get ready to learn together.